It's hot, it's already bright, it's 23 degrees and it's not even 9 o'clock in the morning yet, and humidity is already at 70%. So if I look bedraggled and sweaty and not too good, sorry. I'm trying quite hard not to be put off talking about, politics and news and current events, but it seems like every time I do, it gets demonetized. I'm only earning a pittance off this channel, but the idea is eventually to make it worthwhile me spending a couple of hours every morning doing it, That's my rather modest goal, but they're making it difficult. So if I talk about the news, which I intend to right now, I intend to talk about the van attack outside the mosque. In a short period of time, I'm very likely to be demonetized. But what the hell, let's go for it. And a lot of what I'm going to be saying here is speculation, because this only happened last night, and we have very few details, and those details are likely subject to change. Thankfully, and it feels weird to say this, but thankfully only one person was actually killed. So, that's an improvement, I suppose. And the attacker was caught and not killed. So that's an improvement, I suppose. But what appears to be different is that this appears to be a white British native attacker attacking a specifically Muslim target, albeit using their tactics, Islamic terrorist tactics, driving a van into a bunch of people. So it's kind of the mirror image of the way these things normally are, the way these things have normally been going, and that's really interesting from a political, social point of view. This does raise questions about things like, how do we define terrorism? And how do we define radicalization? And how do we react when the normal excuses and justifications for terrorism are trotted out, when they're trotted out by the opposite sides to those that we normally see? This is all really fascinating, interesting stuff that is going to be interesting to watch how people navigate, because it's so much the reverse of everything else we normally see. It's important, I think, to give this a little bit of context. Now, the target appears to have been Finsbury Park Mosque, which has a history of being associated with extremism. There have been radical preachers and so on associated with that mosque. It appears to have cleaned up its image. How much of that is true or not, we don't know. But it is a very, very selective target in a way that radical Islamic extremist attacks have not been. They have been terror attacks on the general public, whereas this is a very specific target, a very specific attack upon a mosque and its congregation that has been associated with extremism in the past. That speaks to a rather selective, targeted attack, which perhaps fits better the definition of terrorism than we might otherwise think. It suggests that there is an ideology and an understanding of the situation, rather than just an opportunistic attack on any group of Muslims or whatever. So that's a little different already. The guy doesn't appear to have wanted to die. He does allegedly, he said, "I want to kill all Muslims." So we have a motivation. And what's interesting about that is that people are going to see this in terms of retaliation. They're going to see this in terms of retaliation against the Islamic extremist attacks that Britain has suffered in recent months. And it's far easier to comprehend and understand a motive of revenge and retaliation than it is these seemingly fairly random attacks on just any old citizen that have been coming from radical Islamic extremists. And what's interesting about that is that people who excuse, or perhaps more generously try to explain Islamic extremist attacks, will often frame them in terms of retaliation. They will say that this is because of our foreign policy, that this is because of our actions in the Middle East, even though the general population of Britain marched in their millions against this, and the government overruled us in precisely the way that they're reluctant to in a case like Brexit. So already you have a mirror image, and I suspect we will see people trying to explain and justify this attack in the way that they have on the opposite side for Islamic extremist attacks, by saying that this is retaliation, that this is because of our policy in the Middle East. In this case, it'll be, this is retaliation, this is because of Finsbury Park's association with extremism in the past, and this is because of recent terror attacks, so this is a retaliatory attack. Another interesting thing to examine here is the narrative of radicalization. We don't really question this when it comes to Islamic extremists, because we have mosques like Finsbury Park used to that promulgate extremist propaganda and viewpoints. You can point to passages in the religion. There is a big accepted radical definition of Islam that causes problems across the world. There are hate preachers and so on. So, we can point very easily at sources of radicalization, and this is a point of pressure upon which people feel they can act by presenting a more tolerant and accepting version of Islam, perhaps harking back to the Islamic Golden Age and so on. So, there's ways in which people feel that they can apply points of pressure, though the whole censorship issue does still concern me. Direct calls for violence are one thing, but preaching hate is another. We'll come back to this in a second. When it comes to radicalization of what appears to be an individual middle-aged white guy, it's less easy to point to a cause. It's not like the Archbishop of Canterbury is standing up and ranting that we must destroy the heretics or whatever. This doesn't happen. But you can point to sources of radicalization. You can point to the rhetoric of groups like the EDL, for example, or white British nationalists, the handful of genuine white supremacists and white nationalists that exist. But they're not a social force in the same way that radical, violent interpretations of Islam are. They're fairly mainstream. But you can look to things like the Daily Mail and the way it rants about Muslims and immigrants and all the rest of it. So you could say that this guy was radicalized by the Daily Mail, and perhaps on the back of this we will see a push for censorship. Again, I would be wary of that. In both instances, I think it's better to pursue a policy of making sure that there is a plurality of views being expressed, that the hate is being publicly challenged. I don't know how you would do that when it comes to mosques and hate preachers and so on. But when it comes to mainstream media outlets like the Daily Mail, we could perhaps mandate that in order to pierce that bubble that people have of only ever reading the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or similar outlets. That if we require those outlets, we require those news channels to present a plurality of views, then perhaps we can burst that bubble that people have. Maybe we can do something similar on social media, requiring them to have algorithms that serve up news stories that run counter to people's preferences so that they're exposed to other points of view. This is a big issue, and one where I can perhaps see the necessity of intercession to make sure that people's echo chambers are regularly, at least have the chance of being pricked and popped and exposed to other points of view. I'm not sure how you would do that with mosques, but in the case of news, we can certainly look at that. But then, so the point is that the radicalization narrative can exist, but it's harder to pin down in this instance. And the last thing that I think it brings up that's interesting is how we define terrorism. I don't think there's much question in this particular instance. I mean, the motive is political. The attack is one designed to sow terror. It's a mirror image of other attacks that have gone on, and this is obviously a deliberate statement. But the person appears to be acting alone. We do not, as of yet, have white nationalist terrorists. Perhaps this is something that will emerge over time, mirroring what used to happen in Northern Ireland, where you had the IRA on one side and the UDA on the other. That would kind of fit into the cultural zeitgeist, I guess, with the government getting into bed with the DUP, who used to be loyalist terrorists in Northern Ireland. So perhaps we will see the emergence of British nationalist, British loyalist terrorist groups. Up until now, these things have been random actions by individual bigots. And I suspect that this is too, not that that disqualifies it from being terrorism in this instance. But I do think there's a wild difference between some drunken bloke throwing a bacon sandwich at a mosque and an attack like this. I think the first probably isn't terrorism. This, on the other hand, is. And opportunistic racist attacks aren't really terrorism, they're just random spots. This is a problem we've seen in America, with the definition of terrorism being incredibly loosely applied when it comes down to right-wing gun-wielding nutbags, and emphasis on the nutbags, as opposed to being very tightly applied when it comes to events that appear to be Islamic terrorism. The definition of terrorism can be fairly malleable, it seems, and twisted and suited to people's agendas as they want. So it's possible to inflate numbers of one category while reducing them in another, and this probably isn't a good way to go about things. Perhaps we need to make a definitional difference between organized and meaningful terrorism and these kind of singular lone wolf attacks. Perhaps that's how we should make a definitional difference: organization versus singular, and otherwise keep a fairly loose and consistent definition of terrorism. So, you know, violence for political ends, explicitly political ends. Then maybe we might get some more honest statistics on this thing. But this incident does definitely seem to also challenge a little bit how we define terrorism. It's certainly making me think about it. As I said near the start, there are problems covering current affairs, politics, the news on YouTube. The new policies around advertising are absurdly strict. So if you talk about anything like this, your video is likely to get demonetized. So if you like this kind of relatively calm analysis, if you like hearing a more left-wing perspective that's still sane and not blowing up campuses and running professors out, then please do consider supporting me. And if you don't want to support me and what I'm doing here, you know, I don't only talk about these things, I talk about a huge variety of things. But if you want to support current affairs and news on YouTube from different perspectives, then if you're not going to support me, please consider supporting someone like David Pakman, Dave Rubin, or Secular Talk, as they're all suffering hits to their advertising revenue from increased recent paranoia, and this especially hits people who cover the news and who cover current affairs. It's also hitting horror channels, so if you follow any of those, go and check and see how they're doing. And the Zombie Goes Boom guys have also been horribly affected because they have weapons and fake zombie dummies in their videos, which apparently is no longer allowed to be monetized. So there's plenty of people out there that need your help. If you don't feel like helping me, just go go and find someone you can support. Even $1 a month helps anybody who covers these kinds of controversial content. Zang.